They swore before the whole household that she had stolen the diamonds, and the young gentlewoman they branded a thief could have named the true thief with a single breath, and did not, because the one proof that would clear her lay locked in a strong box in London to which she alone held the key, and she did not yet know it. Clemence Aldous was 24 years old and gently born and poor, a lady by blood and a servant by necessity, earning her bread as the paid companion and reader to a cold, exacting ancient family in a great grey house at the edge of the moor. And on a raw bright morning in the autumn of that year the whole weight of that house came down upon her at once. When the dowager's famous diamonds were found gone from their case, and the household, one after another, turned its eyes upon the friendless young woman who read to the old lady and had the run of her rooms and had nothing in the world and no one to speak for her. She had not taken them. She had never in her life so much as coveted them. But she was poor, and alone, and a stranger of no family that anyone there need trouble to respect. And the man who had truly taken the diamonds, and who had taken good care that the blame should fall exactly where it fell, was the smooth, plausible, indispensable man of business of the house, Mr. Julian Craik, a distant kinsman of the family who managed all its money and had for years been quietly stealing it, and who had lifted the diamonds himself to cover the pit of his own embezzlements, and had framed the companion to hide the theft and to be rid, into the bargain, of the one person under that roof, whose dead father had once held the proof of his earlier frauds. And so Clemence Aldous stood accused before them all, dismissed without a character, her name a byword for a thief, faced with disgrace and ruin, and the very real shadow of the Gaol, and she could prove nothing, and no one would believe her, and the whole visible weight of the world was against her. And she did not yet know that the small worn portrait miniature she wore always on a ribbon beneath her gown, her father's last gift, her dead mother's likeness on ivory in a plain gold case, a thing of pure sentiment that Julian Craik and all that cold house passed over as beneath a thief's notice, held folded behind its ivory the one key that could unlock the strong box in London where her father's careful love had hidden both the proof that she was no thief, and the proof that Julian Craik was, nor that the cold proud man who ruled that grey house, and who had at first believed the worst of her with the rest, would be the one to fetch that truth up into the light before a magistrate and the whole assembled household on the very day her ruin was to be made complete. It was the middle of October, and the moor was going brown and gold under a hard clear sky, when the diamonds were found gone and Clemence Aldous's world came down. And that grey autumn is where the turning of her story begins, though the theft that made it necessary had been years in the quiet making in the hands of Julian Craik. I have been waiting a long time to tell you Clemence's story, the whole of it, the stolen diamonds and the false accusation and the smooth thief who meant to see her hang for his own crime, and the small likeness against her heart that held the key to it all, and the cold hard man who first believed her guilty and then came to see her true and to break the frame that had been built around her. So settle in, and stay close by her side through what is coming, because a young gentlewoman who has been called a thief before the whole household she served, and turned out without a character, and made to feel the Gaol's cold breath on her neck with no friend to speak for her and no proof she can lay her hand on, is about to find that her gentle, foreseeing father saw the danger long before it came, and left her, folded small behind the ivory of a thing no thief would ever trouble to steal, the means to undo the whole false design. And what she does when at last the strong box is opened and her own truth is read out before the very people who thought they had her ruined is a thing worth staying for to the very end. But to understand how a gently born young woman came to stand accused of a theft she never dreamed of, in a house where she had served faithfully and been trusted, with her name blackened and the law itself gathering against her and no visible way to clear it, you have to understand what had been done to her, and how it was ever possible, and who the people were who did it. For the cruelty of her story turns on a thing that has ruined more honest servants in more great houses than any open violence ever did. which is the ease with which the poor and the friendless may be made to bear the crimes of the plausible and the powerful, and the strange readiness of the comfortable world to believe a thief of anyone who has nothing. She had not always been poor, and that is the first thing to know of her, for it made the fall so much the harder to bear. She was the only child of Mr. Tuck, Bartram Aldous, a gentleman of the middling sort, a man of no great estate but of real cultivation and a warm and honest heart, who had lived quietly in a pleasant house in a cathedral town and had spent his modest means and his whole leisure upon the things he loved: his books, his few good pictures, his cabinet of coins and curiosities, and, above all, the study and the collecting of fine portrait miniatures, those small exquisite likenesses on ivory and vellum that were the passion of his life. He was a virtuoso, a connoisseur, a man whom the great collectors and the clever dealers knew and trusted, for he had a true eye and an honest name, and though he was never rich, he had made himself, in that one small field, a man of standing and of consequence, whose word on a doubtful miniature was worth more than another man's oath. He had married for love a gentle, clever, delicate lady, and had lost her young when their daughter was but 7, and the loss had grieved him deeply and turned him tender and careful, and thereafter he had bound himself more closely than ever to the motherless girl who was all he had left of the wife he had loved. He kept her by him, and taught her himself. Far beyond the common run of a girl's schooling, she read with him, and drew with him, and learned from him to know a true thing from a false one, a good hand from a forged one, the marks and the signs and the little honesties by which a connoisseur reads the truth of a made thing, and she grew into a young woman of unusual cultivation and unusual discernment, quiet and grave and deeply taught, with a clear, steady eye and a habit of looking at a thing until she understood it, and a modest, reserved manner that hid, from all but those who knew her well, the strength and the fine, trained intelligence beneath. She was no fine lady to be idle and admired. She was her scholarly father's pupil and companion, and she had learned from him, without knowing how much she would one day need it, to see clearly and to keep her own counsel and to trust the evidence of her own careful eyes above the loud opinions of the world. And her father, loving her and knowing that he could leave her little, had given her in place of a fortune 2 things that he believed would serve her better: a mind that could earn its bread with credit anywhere, and one small precious object that he charged her, very gravely, to keep always by her. For Bartram Aldous, in the last years of his life, had come to know that he was failing, and that he would leave his daughter poor. His small means, never large, had been strained by his collecting and by an unlucky investment or 2, and he knew that when he was gone there would be little for her but the necessity of earning her own living, gently and respectably, as a governess or a companion, in the houses of the rich. He faced it without bitterness, being a man of sense, but he was a careful and a foreseeing man, and he was uneasy, in a way he could not quite name, about the world he was leaving her to, a world in which a portionless gentlewoman of no family and no protector was a creature strangely without defense, at the mercy of any employer's caprice or any powerful person's malice, with no one to take her part and nothing to fall back on. And so he had done quietly and in his last months a careful thing, a thing he told her almost nothing of, and it was the most careful thing of his life, and I will come to it, for it is the hinge of everything. He gave her, near the end, the one object he charged her above all to keep: a small portrait miniature of her mother's own dear likeness, painted in the years of their happiness, a lovely thing on ivory set in a plain worn gold case that opened on a hinge, and he bade her wear it always, on a ribbon against her heart, and never part with it, and keep it safe. And he told her, holding her hands and looking at her very gravely, that it was more than it seemed, and that if ever she were in a true extremity, alone and wronged and without other help, she was to look behind the ivory, where he had set something for her, and do exactly what she found there written and trust it, and tell no one until she must. She had thought it, at the time, only the tender fancy of a dying father who could not bear to leave his motherless girl unguarded, a sweet sad charge laid on the last gift of his love. She had not looked. She had not been in any extremity then, she had only been grieving. But she had worn the little likeness faithfully ever since, against her heart through all that came after. And she would have need of it now. For her father died when she was 23, of a slow decline, and left her, as he had known he must, very poor. And Clemence Aldous, who had never in her life had to think of money, found herself alone in the world with a little furniture and fewer books than she had grown up among. Most of the good pictures and the precious miniatures sold to pay the last of his debts, and to leave her a small clear sum that would not keep her a 12-month, and the plain hard necessity before her of earning her own bread. She met it, as she met everything, quietly and with courage. She had no near relations to turn to, and no fortune, and no protector. But she had her cultivation and her good name and her steady sense, and she did the only thing a gentlewoman so placed could decently do. She sought, and after a little while she found a respectable situation as a companion, a paid lady companion and reader, in a household that wanted just such a person, gentle and accomplished and cheap. And the household she came to, in the late spring of that year, was the great grey house of the Denholms on the edge of the northern moor, the seat of the Baron's Winterset. And there, all unknowing, she walked into the place where her ruin was waiting. The family she came to serve was an old one, cold and proud and much reduced, clinging to its ancient consequence in a house too large and too costly for its shrunken means. The head of it in name was Alaric Denholm, the young Baron Winterset, a grave, hard, silent man of some 34, who had come young to a burdened title and a tangled estate, and had spent his manhood in the cold hard business of trying to keep the old house and the old name from going wholly under. But the real ruler of the household, and the mistress Clemence was engaged to serve, was the Baron's mother, the Dowager Baroness, old Lady Almira Denholm, a formidable, exacting, sharp-tongued old lady of near 80, proud as Lucifer and hard as flint, who kept her state in the best rooms of the great house, and ruled her son and her servants with a rod of iron, and clung, above all the wreck of the family's fortunes, to the one splendor that remained to her, the Winterset diamonds. For the diamonds were the last great treasure of that fallen house, a magnificent old parure of necklace and eardrops and bracelets, a blaze of great white stones in a heavy antique setting, worth a very fortune, the pride and the obsession of the old Baroness, who could no longer afford to keep the house warm but would not for the world have parted with a single stone, and who wore them still on the rare grand occasions and kept them, the rest of the year, in a locked case in her own dressing-room, and gloated over them, and counted them her whole remaining consequence in the world. And it was to read to this proud hard old lady, and to bear with her tempers, and to fetch and carry and be at her beck, that Clemence Aldous was engaged, and she did it well, and patiently, and with a quiet dignity that the old Baroness, in her sharp way, came grudgingly to value, so that within a few months the companion had the old lady's confidence, and the run of her rooms, and the keeping of her keys, and a place of trust in the household that a friendless young woman was glad of, and that was to be turned, by a cleverer and colder head than the old Baroness's, into the very rope to hang her. For over the whole tangled money of that failing house there presided one man, and that man was the true author of everything that came upon Clemence Aldous, and it is time to know him. His name was Mr. Julian Craik, and he was the man of business, the steward, the agent, the confidential factotum of the Denholms, a distant poor kinsman of the family who had made himself, over 15 patient years, indispensable to it. He was a smooth, plausible, comfortable-looking man of about 50, with a soft voice and a ready deferential smile, and an air of grave, devoted honesty that had won and kept the trust of the whole family. The old Baroness relied on him utterly. The young Baron, absorbed in the larger struggle of the estate, left the detail of the money wholly in his hands, and the household one and all thought Mr. Craik the very soul of faithful service. And he was a thief. He had been a thief for years, set to manage the money of a proud old family that was too grand to look closely at its own accounts and too reduced to be able to afford honesty. Julian Craik had discovered, early and easily, how simple it was to bleed such a house white, and he had done it. Quietly and steadily and with a cold nerve, cooking the accounts and falsifying the rents and pocketing. Year upon year, some small and large, until he had embezzled a very great deal of money, and had grown beneath his humble smiling exterior a warm private fortune of his own out of the ruin of his employers. He was clever and careful, and he covered his tracks with a forger's patience, and for years no one had suspected him, and he had gone on comfortably, the trusted thief, robbing the hard old lady of everything but her diamonds and robbing the grave young baron of the very means to save his house. But cleverer men than Julian Craik have found that a long fraud is like a fire that must always be fed. His peculations had grown, and his risks with them, and by that autumn he had reached a crisis. He had, in his greed and his overconfidence, misapplied and lost a great sum, more than he could quietly replace out of the ordinary running of the estate. There was to be, that winter, a reckoning of the accounts that he could not for once wholly control, a matter of a mortgage and a lawyer that would bring an outside eye upon the books, and Julian Craik saw, with a cold clear terror behind his smiling face, that unless he could find, quickly, a great sum of ready money to cover the hole he had made, his whole long comfortable fraud was in danger of coming to light, and with it the gaol, and the rope perhaps, and the ruin of everything he had so patiently stolen. He needed money, a great deal of money at once, and there was, in that whole reduced house, only one thing left worth a great deal of money, and it was the old Baroness's diamonds. And so Julian Craik, cornered and desperate beneath his calm, resolved upon the boldest and the wickedest stroke of his whole wicked career. He would steal the diamonds. He would take the last treasure of the house he had already half ruined, and turn it into the ready money that would cover his frauds and save his neck, and he would do it in such a way that the blame should fall, surely and completely, upon another, so that when the theft was discovered, as it must be, there should be a thief ready to hand, and no shadow of suspicion should ever come near the faithful Mr. Craik. He had thought it all out, coldly and carefully as he thought out everything, and he had seen at once who the victim must be. It must be someone within the house, with access to the old lady's rooms, someone poor and friendless, and of no family or consequence to make a stir or command belief, someone whose word would weigh as nothing against the united suspicion of the household, and who could be ruined and turned out and silenced with no one the wiser and no one to care. And there was, ready to his hand, exactly such a person, the new companion, the portionless gentlewoman Clemence Aldous, who had the run of the old lady's rooms and the keeping of her keys, who was poor and alone and unprotected, and who would make in every particular the perfect thief. She was the ideal scapegoat. She might have been designed for it. And Julian Craik, looking at the quiet, friendless young woman across the great cold hall, felt no more compunction in planning her ruin than a spider feels for the fly, and laid his plans to fasten his own crime about her neck. But there was more to it, in Julian Craik's cold calculating mind, than the mere convenience of a scapegoat, for it happened, by a chance that seemed to him the very finger of his luck, that of all the friendless young women in the world he might have framed, this particular one was the one he had, on his own account, the strongest private reason to wish destroyed. For Julian Craik had recognized the name of Aldous when the new companion came, and had felt at the sound of it a cold private start of alarm, and he had looked, narrowly and secretly, at the quiet grave girl, and had satisfied himself that she was indeed the daughter of the late Mr. Bartram Aldous of the cathedral town, the connoisseur, the collector of miniatures, and that knowledge had frightened him, and then, as his plan formed, had delighted him. For years before, in the earlier and smaller days of his frauds, Julian Craik had done a certain piece of dishonest business, a forgery and a cheat in the matter of a valuable miniature and some money that went with it, that had touched, at the edge, the affairs of the Aldous family, and Bartram Aldous, honest connoisseur that he was, had at the time seen through the cheat, and had come by certain proofs of Craik's dishonesty, certain letters and a certain forged attribution in Craik's own hand, and had kept them quietly, meaning perhaps one day to use them, and had let Craik know that he held them, so that Craik had gone for years in a cold buried dread of the honest collector who could, if he chose, expose and ruin him. Bartram Aldous had died, and had never used the proofs, being a gentleman with no taste for revenge and larger sorrows on his mind, and Julian Craik had breathed again, thinking the danger dead with the man. And now here was the man's daughter, come of all places into the very house where Craik was steward, and Craik could not for his life be sure how much she knew, or whether her father had told her, or left her, the proofs that could destroy him. It was intolerable to him. It was a standing danger under his own roof, and it turned his cold convenience into a hot private necessity. To frame Clemence Aldous for the theft of the diamonds would not only find him his scapegoat and his money, it would rid him once and for all of the daughter of the one man who had ever held him in his hand, disgrace her past all believing, drive her out ruined and discredited so that nothing she might ever say or produce against him would be given a moment's credit, and lay the old ghost of his frauds forever. It was, he told himself, a masterpiece, and he set about it with the cold thoroughness of a man securing his whole future at a stroke. He was in no hurry, and he made no slip. Through the early autumn he laid his ground with a patient wickedness. He let fall, here and there, to this servant and that, and once or twice, gravely and reluctantly, as though it pained his loyalty to say it, to the old Baroness herself, small quiet poisonous hints against the companion, that the young woman was perhaps not quite so simple as she seemed, that a person so poor, with the handling of so much that was valuable, bore watching, that he had heard she came of people who had fallen from better things and might feel the sting of her poverty the more, that he would not for the world accuse anyone, but that he thought her ladyship would do well to have a care of her keys. He did it so softly, and with so grave and reluctant an air of mere faithful prudence, that it seemed the very opposite of malice. But he knew his hard, suspicious old mistress, and he knew that he was sowing, in that proud, jealous, grasping mind, a slow seed of distrust of the poor young companion that would spring up, when the moment came, into instant and unshakable conviction. And he chose his moment with care. There was to be, that October, a great dinner at the house, a rare grand occasion, the sort of thing the old Baroness lived for, and she would wear, of course, her diamonds, and they would be taken out of their locked case, and worn and admired, and then, in the bustle and lateness of the night, put away again. And Julian Craik, who as steward had a general oversight of the whole house and a duplicate of half its keys and the coming and going of a trusted servant that no one questioned, saw that here was his opportunity, in the confusion of the great night, to make the diamonds vanish, and to arrange the small false trail of evidence that would point, straight and damning, at Clemence Aldous. The night of the dinner came, and everything fell out as Craik had planned it. The old Baroness wore her diamonds, and blazed in them, and was gracious and grand, and Clemence, who as companion had helped to dress her, and had handled the case and the keys under the old lady's sharp eye, waited on her through the long evening, and was seen by the servants to go more than once, at her mistress's bidding, to and from the dressing-room where the diamonds case was kept. And late that night, when the guests were gone, and the tired old Baroness had had her diamonds taken off and, as she believed, locked safely away by her own hand with the companion helping, and had gone to her bed, Julian Craik did his work. He had, that evening, contrived to be about the upper part of the house. He had a key, and in the small hours when the house slept, he took the diamonds from their case, all but a single eardrop that he kept back for his own cold purpose. And he carried the great treasure away, and hid it where he had prepared to hide it, in a place known to no one but himself, to be turned into money at his leisure. And then he laid his false trail. He took the one eardrop he had kept, and he carried it, in the dead of that night, to the small plain room where Clemence Aldous slept, and while she slept he hid it there, cunningly but not too cunningly, wrapped in a handkerchief and thrust to the back of a drawer among her few poor things, where a search would be sure to find it, and where its finding would look exactly like the careless concealment of a frightened amateur thief. And he added, for good measure, another touch or two of the same cold art, a whispered word, next day, to a housemaid, that he had thought he heard someone moving in the passage by the dressing-room in the night, toward the companion's end of the house. A grave reluctant mention, when the loss was found, that the companion alone besides her ladyship had handled the case and the keys. And then he waited, with his smooth grave face, for the storm to break, and it broke exactly where and how he had meant it to. For the loss was found next morning, when the old Baroness, in her jealous way, went to gloat over her treasure and found the case empty. And the great house was thrown into an uproar of horror and alarm. And from the very first moment, guided by the slow poison Craik had been dropping for weeks and by the grave hints he now let fall, every eye and every suspicion turned upon the poor friendless companion who had had the run of the rooms and the handling of the keys. The old Baroness, her hard proud heart wild with the loss of her one treasure, and her mind long since prepared by Craik's whisperings, seized upon Clemence's guilt at once, with the unreasoning certainty of a frightened angry old woman who wants a culprit and has been taught where to find one, and she accused her, to her face, before the assembled household, in a passion of grief and fury, of being a thief and a viper she had warmed in her bosom, a beggarly nobody who had robbed the hand that fed her. And Clemence Aldous, struck to the heart, white and trembling with the shock and the shame of it, denied it, steadily and truthfully and with all the plain force of an honest soul. She had not taken the diamonds, she said. She knew nothing of them, she was no thief, but she set it into a wall of cold disbelief. For the household had already made up its mind. And her very poverty and friendlessness, that should have moved them to doubt, were taken instead as the proof of her guilt. And then Julian Craik, gravely, reluctantly, as one performing a painful duty, suggested that in fairness to all, and to clear the innocent, the servants' rooms should be searched, and the search was made, and in the back of a drawer in the companion's room, wrapped in a handkerchief, they found the single diamond eardrop that Craik had hidden there. And that was the end of Clemence Aldous, so far as belief or mercy went, for there was the stolen jewel, in her own room, among her own things, and what more could any reasonable person want? The find was taken for certain proof. Her denials became, in every ear, the mere brazen lying of a thief caught red-handed, and the whole cold house closed against her, united and satisfied and pitiless, in the settled conviction that the poor companion had robbed her mistress and been justly found out. And here, before I tell you how far the ruin ran and how low the world brought her, I must ask one thing of you, because everything in Clemence's story is about to begin, quietly, to turn, and I would not want you to miss the turning. If you've made it this far into Clemence Aldous' story, hit subscribe. Because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. There, that is the only time I will ask. Now stay close by her side, for she is about to be more alone than she has ever been in her life, and to learn how little the truth is worth to a comfortable world that has already decided against the poor. And she was very much alone in it, which was the bitterest part of the whole bitter business. For there was no one in that cold house or in all the country round to whom she could turn, or who would think to doubt. The tale ran out into the neighborhood before the day was well begun, carried by the servants and colored by Craik's grave regretful tongue. And it lost nothing in the telling. The poor companion, the beggarly nobody the good old Baroness had charitably taken in, had repaid her mistress's kindness by robbing her of her diamonds, and had been caught with the plunder in her very drawer. And the comfortable world that heard it believed it, easily and at once, as the comfortable world always believes the worst of those who have nothing. For a thief who is poor and friendless and of no family is the most natural thing in the world, and no one need trouble to look twice. The great ladies of the county, who had thought the connoisseur's portionless daughter a very good sort of young person while she was useful and quiet, discovered now that they had always felt there was something not quite to be trusted about her. "I am never deceived in a face," said Mrs. Prudence Gorse, a plump, complacent, well-to-do lady of the neighborhood who had never in her life looked below one. Nodding over her tea, there was a boldness in that young woman's eye, for all her still ways that I own I never liked. And handsome cold Lady Cassandra Mead, who had a way of pitying people cruelly, said that it was very shocking, but that one really could not wonder, that these decayed gentlefolk who came down in the world were always the worst. being eaten up with envy of their betters and taught above their station, and that it was a lesson against admitting such persons to one's intimacy at all. Not one of them thought to ask whether the thing were even true. Not one of them, hearing that a friendless young woman had been found guilty in an afternoon on the word of a steward and the finding of a single stone, thought to wonder whether a friendless creature were not the very person a real thief would choose to hide behind. They had their culprit, and their comfortable thrill of horror, and their confirmation that the poor were not to be trusted, and they turned their backs, all of them, and left Clemence Aldous to her ruin. So that she learned in that one day how very solitary a wronged creature may be who is poor, and has no name that anyone need respect, and no one at all to believe her. And Clemence Aldous stood in the midst of them. Ruined, she saw in that dreadful hour the whole shape of the thing that had fallen on her. Though she did not yet know the hand that had built it, she saw the diamond in the housekeeper's palm and the cold certainty in every face, and the impossibility of making one soul there believe the truth. And she understood, with a sick sinking of the heart, that she was lost, that her word was worth nothing against that damning find, that she had not a friend in the house nor a proof in the world, and that she stood a gently born and honest woman, branded a common thief before them all, with disgrace certain and the gaol itself a near and dreadful possibility. For it was no light thing, in that age, to be taken for the theft of a jewel of great value. It was a hanging matter, or near it, or transportation at the least. And though the proud old family might, for the honor of the house, shrink from the public scandal of a trial and choose rather to hush the thing and simply cast the thief out, ruined and disgraced, that mercy was not certain, and the shadow of the law lay cold across her. She was dismissed on the instant, without a character, which in itself was ruin to a woman who must live by her good name. She was to be gone from the house within the day, and she went up to her little room to gather her few poor things under the eye of a servant set to watch that she stole nothing more. A disgraced and broken woman, cast out friendless and nameless into a world that had already condemned her, with nowhere to go and no one to believe her, and the brand of a thief upon her forever. And she had, though she scarcely thought of it in that first black hour, one small worn secret thing that they had not thought to take from her, that no one had thought worth the taking, one last gift of her father's love, waiting against her heart for exactly such a day as this. For she had, always, the miniature. She wore it still, as she had worn it faithfully through all her grief, on its plain ribbon about her neck, hidden beneath her gown against her heart, the small worn portrait of her mother. A lovely delicate likeness on ivory, her mother's own dear face painted in the years of happiness, set in a plain worn gold case that opened on a little hinge. It was the last gift of the father she had loved, and the dearest thing she owned, and a thing of pure and precious sentiment. And when in the search the servants had turned over her few poor possessions, they had glanced at the little likeness and passed it by. For what was a shabby old portrait of a dead woman worth to people hunting a fortune in diamonds? It was beneath their notice, and beneath Julian Craik's, who reckoned everything by its price and saw in the worn little case only a pauper's keepsake of no value, and that contempt, though none of them knew it, was exactly why it was safe. But as Clemence stood in her stripped little room, gathering her things with shaking hands under the servant's cold eye, her fingers went, as they always did in her trouble, to the little likeness at her heart, and there came back to her, with a strange new and piercing weight, the thing her father had told her long ago in his last weeks, and that she had put by as a dying man's tender fancy and never thought of since. He had held her hands, she remembered, and looked at her very gravely, and had said that the little portrait was more than it seemed, that if ever she should find herself in a true extremity, alone and wronged, and without other help, she was to look behind the ivory, where he had set something for her, and to do exactly what she found there written, and trust it, and tell no one until she must. She had thought it then only the sweet sad anxiety of a father who could not bear to leave his motherless girl unguarded. She had not looked. She had never been in any extremity she had been safe. But she was in a true extremity now, wronged past all bearing and alone and cast out ruined. And standing there in the stripped little room, her father's grave face rose before her, and his strange words, and she thought, with a sudden trembling of the heart, he set something behind the ivory. He told me to look. In a true extremity. And I am in a true extremity now. And here I must tell you the thing that neither Clemence nor Julian Craik nor all that cold house knew, the careful secret thing that Bartram Aldous had done in his last months and told almost no one, for it is the hinge of the whole story and the answer to the perfect frame. Bartram Aldous, in the last year of his life, knowing himself failing and knowing he would leave his daughter poor and friendless in a hard world, had been uneasy in his mind, and had turned over, with a father's foreseeing love, all the ways in which a portionless gentlewoman without a protector might be wronged and left defenseless. And he had resolved to leave her, against any evil day, one hidden line of defense that no ordinary malice could reach or spoil. And he had had, moreover, one particular unquiet thought, for he had never forgotten Julian Craik. He had known, years before, of Craik's dishonesty. He had come by the proofs of it, the letters and the forged attribution in Craik's own hand, and had kept them by him, and though he had never used them, being a gentle man, he had had, in his last illness, an obscure prompting, a careful man's instinct, that those old proofs of a living rogue's guilt ought not to be let perish with him, but ought to be preserved, safe and ready, in case they should ever be needed, by his daughter, or by anyone, against the man. And so Bartram Aldous had done a quiet and a careful thing. He had gathered together the proofs of Julian Craik's old fraud, the damning letters and the forged paper in Craik's own hand, and he had gathered too certain other papers of his own that bore on his daughter's small affairs and her rights, and he had lodged the whole, sealed up in a strong packet, in a sealed strong box with an honest and independent London attorney of his own choosing, a man of unimpeachable character named Mr. Josiah Wexford, wholly unconnected with anyone who might one day wrong her, and he had left with that attorney a solemn charge, that the box was to be kept safe and given up to no one but his daughter, or one bearing her authority and the token he named. And the token, and the key to the whole, he had hidden in the one place he was sure would stay always with her, and that no grasping hand would ever think worth taking, folded small behind the ivory of her mother's miniature. In the plain gold case he bade her wear always at her heart, he had set a slip of thin paper in his own hand, giving the name and the street of that London attorney, and the number of that sealed box, and a word of direction, that this was her surety, her father's provision against any evil day, and that she was to send to that house and open that box if ever she stood in need of what it held. He had made a shabby little portrait the key to a strong box. He had hidden his daughter's vindication and a rogue's ruin behind the painted face of her dead mother. And then he had died, trusting that if ever the worst came she would remember, and look, and be armed. And the worst had come, and for a while, in her grief and her shock, she had not remembered, or had remembered only as a sad sweet fancy, until now cast out and branded and desperate, with the false accusation ringing in her ears, she remembered her father's grave face and his strange words, and her hand crept up to the little worn case against her heart, and she thought, he set something behind the ivory. And I am in a true extremity now. But before she could look, and before I can tell you what came of it, I must bring into the tale the man who was to be, though neither of them could then have dreamed it, the breaker of the frame and the answer to her ruin. For on that very day of her disgrace, all unknowing, the cold master of the house was drawn, by the ugliness of the thing done under his own roof, out of the settled indifference in which he had first let her be condemned. And to understand why he of all that hard household was the one who would not in the end let the wrong stand, and why he came to see the truth when everyone about him was so sure of the lie, you must understand who he was, for the world had him quite wrong, as it usually has such men. The Baron Winterset, Alaric Denholm, a man of some 34, was reckoned, by the county that knew him a little and liked him less, a cold, hard, proud and disagreeable man, grave and silent and unsmiling, with a level dark eye that gave nothing away, and a short way with fools, and a shorter way with anyone who presumed on him. A man who kept himself apart and asked no one's love and seemed to care for nothing in the world but the cold hard struggle to keep his ruined house from falling. Cold as the moor, said the neighbors, a hard, proud man with no heart in him, wrapped up in his acres and his pride. And all of it, as such verdicts commonly are, was the truth turned inside out. For the Baron was not heartless, he was only proud, and reserved, and worn hard by long trouble, and honest past the point that comfortable society finds comfortable. He had come to his title young, and to an estate already half ruined by the extravagance of his forebears, and he had spent the whole of his manhood in a grim, lonely, unthanked struggle to save it, denying himself everything, pinching and contriving and laboring like his own steward, carrying alone the whole crushing weight of a great name and a small purse, and a proud, exacting mother who understood nothing of the shifts by which he kept her in her state. It had made him hard, and silent and old before his time. It had shut him up in himself and dried the show of feeling out of him. But it had not killed the deep, strong, honest heart beneath, nor the stern sense of justice that was the bedrock of him, nor a capacity for a deep and loyal feeling that he had shown to no one, and had all but forgotten in himself. He could not abide a lie, nor a cruelty, nor an injustice. He had a plain, stern rectitude that was the one luxury his poverty had left him. And though he had, in the first shock of the theft, half believed the companion guilty with the rest, for the evidence seemed plain and he had no reason then to doubt it, and his mind was full of the loss and the trouble of it, there was in him, beneath the cold surface, something that would not quite lie easy, some stern, honest instinct that was troubled, from the first, by the thing that was being done. For the Baron Winterset, cold and preoccupied as he was a just man and a noticing one, and even in the uproar of that dreadful morning, something in the business had jarred upon him and would not be still. He had looked once hard and searching at the accused companion's white steady face as she denied the charge, and he had seen there, or thought he had seen, not the brazen falsehood of a guilty creature, but something else, something that troubled him, a plain white shock and a steady truthful denial and a proud endurance that did not fit, to his stern reading, the guilt they laid on her. He had marked, too, with a faint cold unease he did not then pursue, how very pat and complete the evidence was, how neatly the single jewel had been found, how ready the whole household had been to believe, and how zealously his mother's mind had been prepared to the conviction. And though he put these things by, in the press of the moment, and let the dismissal go forward as his mother and Craik urged it, they lay in his stern honest mind like small stones in a shoe, and would not let him be. He was not a man to act on a vague unease, but he was a man to whom a vague unease, once lodged, was a thing that had to be resolved, one way or the other, before he could have peace. And as that day wore on, and the first heat of the loss cooled a little, the trouble in him grew rather than lessened. It was not that he had any warmth for the girl, he scarcely knew her, and had no reason to take her part. It was that his stern soul could not endure the possibility, once it had entered his mind, that a wrong might be being done under his own roof, in his own name, and an innocent creature ruined. And the more he turned it over, with his hard, clear-seeing mind, the less easy he grew, until he found that he could not, in honesty, let the thing simply pass as everyone about him wished it to pass. He resolved, coldly and privately, telling no one, that before that young woman was cast out to her ruin he would at the least look into the matter with his own eyes, and satisfy himself, one way or the other, of the truth. For a just man, he thought grimly, owes that much even to a thief, and far more, if there should be any doubt, to one who might not be a thief at all. And in this he was confirmed, that very afternoon, by the one honest outside voice that reached him, for Dr. Emery Fielding, the physician of the district, a shrewd, humane, sensible man who had attended the old Baroness for years and knew the household better than most, came to the house on his rounds, heard the tale, and said bluntly to the Baron, as one plain man to another, that he had known many a thief in his time, and this quiet young gentlewoman did not sort with any of them, and that he for one would want a great deal better proof than a single stone in a drawer before he ruined a friendless creature on the word of Julian Craik. The Baron said little, but the plain good sense of it, coming from a man he respected and who had no interest to serve, struck home, and hardened the stern unease in him into a settled resolve. And there was one thing more that moved him, though he scarcely owned it to himself, and it was the memory of the woman's face. He was a lonely man, and a starved one, in the deep hungers of the heart, though he had long forgotten it, and something in the still white proud endurance of the accused companion, the way she had stood alone and friendless in the midst of them all and denied the charge and asked no pity and did not break, had reached, without his knowing it, some deep buried place in him that had not been touched in years. He put it from him. He told himself it was nothing to the purpose, a mere idle fancy, but the face went with him, the grave gray steady eyes that had met the whole cold house without flinching, and it sharpened his stern unease into something almost like a personal need to know the truth of her. And so, moved by his honest instinct and his stern justice and, beneath these, by something he did not name, the cold Baron Winterset did the thing that no one else in that house would have troubled to do. And that broke, in the end, the whole cold frame. Before the day was out, before she was gone, he sought the accused woman herself, and looked at her and listened to her and gave her, alone of all the world, the chance to be heard. He came to her in the little cold parlor where she had been set to wait under guard for the trap that was to carry her away, and he came alone, and closed the door, and stood a moment looking at her with his hard unreadable dark eyes before he spoke. And Clemens, worn past fear by the day's dreadful blows, rose and faced him steadily, expecting nothing but a fresh reproach, the master come to add his cold word to her ruin. And she was startled, past her guard, when instead he said, in his level quiet voice, that he had come to hear what she had to say for herself, plainly, with no one by, that the evidence against her was heavy, and he would not deceive her that it was not, but that he was not wholly satisfied, and that he would hear the truth from her own lips before he let the matter go as it stood. And he bade her, gravely, tell him, simply and without fear, whether she had taken the diamonds, and if she had not, what she knew and what she thought, and something in the plain stern fairness of it, in the unlooked-for justice of the cold hard man who alone of them all would hear her, broke through Clemens's proud reserve and her despair, and she told him the truth, steadily and simply and with the plain unmistakable ring of an honest soul, that she had not taken the diamonds, that she had never touched them but at her mistress's bidding and under her mistress's eye, that she knew nothing of the theft and nothing of how the single jewel had come to be in her drawer, and that she was as innocent as the day, and could prove nothing, and knew that no one would believe her, but that it was the truth before God, and she would say it though it cost her her life. And the Baron Winterset heard her out, in a hard attentive silence, watching her face and weighing her words with his stern clear judgment, and when she had done, he was silent a while longer, and then he said, slowly, that he believed her. He had come, he said, half persuaded of her guilt, but he had watched liars before, and honest folk before, and he knew, as surely as a just man may know anything, the difference between the two, and he did not believe that the woman before him was a thief. And he told her, quietly, that if she were indeed innocent, then a great wrong was being done, and that he, in whose house and in whose name it was being done, would not suffer it to stand if there were any way on earth to come at the truth. And he asked her then, the question that unlocked everything, whether she had any means, any proof, any thread however slight, by which the truth might be found, whether her father, of whom he had heard as a man of honor, had left her nothing, no paper, no friend, no provision, that might serve her in such a strait as this. And Clemens's hand went, of itself, to the small worn case beneath her gown, and she remembered her father's grave face and his strange dying words, and she told the Baron slowly, of the little portrait, and of what her father had said, that if ever she were in a true extremity she was to look behind the ivory, and do what she found written there, and trust it. She had not looked, she said. She had thought it in her grief, only a dying man's tender fancy, but she was in a true extremity now. And the Baron Winterset, who missed nothing, went very still, and said in a low, careful voice, that a careful, loving father who bade his daughter look behind a portrait in her last extremity did not, in his experience of men, speak idle fancies, and that she should look now, before him, that they might see together what her father had left her. And there, in the cold little parlor, with the grey autumn light failing at the window and the trap even then being brought round to the door, Clemence Aldous drew the little worn case from beneath her gown on its ribbon, and with trembling fingers, and the Baron's own penknife to help her, she eased the delicate ivory of her mother's likeness gently up from its setting, and behind it, folded to the size of a fingernail, pressed flat all those years against the back of the little painting, was a slip of thin paper, covered in her father's small, careful hand. And she unfolded it, her fingers not steady at all, and read again, and lifted to the Baron a face gone white and blazing with a wild new hope. For on that slip her father had written the name and the street of a London attorney, Mr. Josiah Wexford, and the number of a sealed strong-box lodged there, and the words, "My dearest child, if you are in need or in any wrong, send to this house and open this box. Herein is your surety, and proof against the man who would harm you. Trust the bearer of this token and be not afraid." Her father had reached out of his grave to arm her, and the cold Baron, reading over her shoulder, understood at once that here was a thread to follow, and the stern trouble in his hard face kindled, for the first time, into the light of a cold, fierce purpose. For here, at last, was the thing that might break the frame. Here was the thread that no one else had troubled to seek. The Baron Winterset saw the whole shape of it in an instant, with his hard, clear, rapid mind. He did not yet know what was in that London box, but he knew that a careful, honest man, who bade his daughter open it in her last extremity and called it her surety and her proof against one who would harm her, had put something there of weight, and he resolved on the instant what must be done. The box must be opened, quickly, quietly, and lawfully, and whatever it held must be brought north and used, before this cruel business was made final and the innocent woman's ruin sealed past mending. And he did a thing then that showed the whole stern quality of him. He did not turn her out. He went, that very hour, cold and resolute, to his astonished and angry mother, and he told her, in his quiet, unanswerable way, that the companion should not leave the house, nor be given to the law, nor her ruin be made public, until he had satisfied himself wholly of the truth of the matter, that there were doubts he meant to resolve, that he was master in that house, whatever her ladyship's grief, and that he would answer for it. The old Baroness stormed, and Julian Craik, when he heard of it, felt the first cold breath of a fear he had thought impossible, and set his smooth wits at once to work to undo this dangerous clemency and hurry the thing to its end. But the Baron was immovable, and he kept the accused woman in the house, in a kind of grave honorable custody, safe for the while from the worst, and he set about, with his cold thoroughness, the fetching up of the truth from London. He did not go himself, for his sudden absence would have been marked and would have warned the guilty, and he meant to stay and hold the ground and watch. But he had a man, a grave, shrewd, entirely trustworthy man of his own, an old servant of the house named Gideon Marsh, who had served the Baron and his father before him and was devoted to him past all buying. And this Gideon Marsh he sent posting to London that very night, armed with a careful letter in the Baron's own hand and with the token, for the attorney, her father's slip said, would give up the box only to his daughter or one bearing her authority and the token he named. And Clemence, by the Baron's advice, sent a line in her own hand claiming her father's provision. And, for the token, the little slip itself in her father's writing, that the honest attorney would know. And so Gideon Marsh went south, hard and fast, through the cold October nights, to find the London house of Mr. B. Josiah Wexford, and to satisfy that careful lawyer of the justice of the case and the truth of the token, and to have the sealed box opened before a notary as the law and the lawyer's own conscience required, and to bring back north, with all the speed of the fastest post, whatever it held, and it was a business of some days. For London was far, and the roads were hard, and the forms must be observed. And those were hard days at the grey house on the moor, for the old Baroness raged, and Julian Craik plotted, and Clemence waited in an agony of hope and dread, and the Baron kept his stern watch, and held them all off, and let no one see the fierce anxiety with which he too awaited the word from London on which an innocent woman's whole life now hung. And Julian Craik, in those days, knew at last the taste of fear, and grew desperate, and began, for the first time in his long, smooth career of fraud, to make the small mistakes that desperation makes. He could not understand the Baron's obstinacy. He had counted on the thing being over in a day, the thief cast out and forgotten, and himself safe with his stolen fortune. And this dangerous delay, this grave withholding of the masters, this keeping of the accused in the house, and this sending of a trusted man on some secret errand, filled him with a cold, creeping dread that his masterpiece was somehow going wrong, though he could not see how. He tried, smoothly and urgently, to work upon the Baron, to press for the thing to be finished, to feed afresh the old Baroness's fury and turn it upon her son's strange clemency. He redoubled his poisonous hints against the companion. He even, growing bolder in his fear, ventured to hint that the master's odd tenderness for a pretty thief might itself become a scandal. But the Baron met all his smooth urgings with a cold level look and a short word that Craik found he could not pass. And the steward, baffled and frightened, fell back on watching, with his sharp uneasy eyes, for what the master meant to do, and on holding himself ready, if the worst came, to fly with what he had stolen. He did not know of the miniature. He did not dream that the accused had held, against her heart all this while, a thing that could destroy him. And least of all did he dream that the honest collector he had feared and thought safely dead had reached out of the grave to lodge, in a London strong-box, the very proofs of his old guilt that were now posting north to hang him. He had reckoned every visible piece on the board, the girl's poverty and friendlessness, the planted jewel, the united suspicion of the house, the old Baroness's fury. The ruin made sure, and found the reckoning perfect. He had overlooked one thing, one only, because he could not see its worth. A shabby little portrait of a dead woman on a ribbon beneath a poor companion's gown, that a dead connoisseur's love had made the key to a strong-box, and that held, folded small, the undoing of his whole cold design. He never thought of the miniature at all. That was his error, and it was enough. And here, while the days of waiting wore on, I must tell you what those days did. Quietly, beneath the great business of the plot to Clemence and to the cold Baron who had become her one defender. For the breaking of the frame is the turn of the story, but the heart of it is the two of them. And I would not have you miss it. They were thrown much together now, in the strange grave intimacy of her danger and her defense, for the Baron, having taken her cause in hand, would come to her, in those days of waiting, to tell her what word there was, or that there was none, and to see that she was used with decency in her honorable custody, and though he would not have owned it, because he found, to his own cold astonishment, that he wished to, and in that close hard fellowship of trouble and hope, the grave silent Baron and the proud reticent companion came, without ever once saying so, to know each other to the bottom, and to be, each to the other, the one true thing in a false and cruel world. He found in her, as they talked in the cold parlor through those anxious days, a mind and a spirit he had never looked to find, a cultivation to match his own starved and buried love of better things, a clear brave sense, a fine-trained discernment, a courage under wrong that shamed the softer women he had known, and a gentleness that had not been soured by all the cruelty done her. And she, who had thought never again to trust any creature in that house, found in the cold hard master, as she came to know him, not the pride and the coldness the world saw, but a stern deep honesty, a lonely starved heart like her own, a strength she could lean on and a justice she could trust, and, beneath the grave silent surface, a capacity for a deep and gentle feeling that he had shown, she began to see, to no one living but herself. She saw how hard his life had been, and how alone. He saw how brave hers was, and how wronged, and each, in the other, found for the first time in a long starved while someone who understood. He was too proud, and too honorable and too careful of her helpless state, to speak a word of love to a woman who was his prisoner and his dependent and whose ruin or rescue lay in his hand. He would have died before he used her extremity to press a suit upon her. But she felt it, in his grave care, and the way his hard face gentled when he looked at her, and the fierce quiet anger on her behalf that broke sometimes through his coldness. And she knew, in her own heart, with a wonder that steadied her through those dreadful days, that she was coming to love him too. This cold, clear, honest man who had believed her when all the world condemned her and had set his whole strength between her and her ruin for no reward. And the knowledge, unspoken between them, was a warmth at the center of the cold, and it held them both. Word came from London on the 4th day, and it was better, far better than even the Baron had dared to hope. Gideon Marsh returned, gray with hard travel and grim with a triumph he could scarcely contain, bearing the strong box's whole contents sealed up under the notary's hand and the attorney's. And the Baron Winterset, opening them in private with Clements at his side and his stern face for once alight, found in them not one weapon but two, and the second was the thunderbolt. The first was Clements's own vindication. Sure and clear among her father's papers was his own plain written account, and the vouchers to go with it of the small honest facts of her life and her father's dealings. Enough to establish past cavil her father's honor and her own good character and the falseness of the charge against her. A shield at the least, of proven respectability to set against the brand of a thief. But the second thing was the ruin of Julian Craik. For there, in that London box kept these several years by the foresight of the honest connoisseur who had never forgotten a rogue, was the whole clear proof of Julian Craik's old and secret guilt, the letters in Craik's own hand, and the forged attribution he had made to cheat in the matter of that valuable miniature years before, and Bartram Aldis's own careful memorandum, dated and exact, setting out the whole history of the fraud he had detected and the proofs he had secured. A full, plain, damning record, in Craik's own writing, that the trusted and faithful Mr. Julian Craik, steward of the Denholms, was and had long been a forger and a cheat. And the Baron, reading it, with his hard clear head for such things, saw the whole matter open before him in a cold blaze of understanding. Here was proof that the very man who had led the accusation against Clements, who had dropped the poison and found the jewels so pat and urged her ruin so zealously, was himself a proven rogue and forger of years' standing, with the strongest reason in the world to wish the daughter of the man who could expose him silenced and discredited and destroyed, and that alone, laid before any fair mind, must shatter the whole case against her, and turn every suspicion clean about, and set the cold clear light of doubt full upon Julian Craik himself. And the Baron, who was no fool, and who had had since the first his own faint cold unease about how the money of his house had gone, put this proof of Craik's forgery beside his own half-formed suspicions of the steward's honesty, and beside the strange pat completeness of the evidence against the companion, and reached, with a cold certainty, the truth, that Craik had stolen the diamonds himself, to cover frauds of his own, and had framed the innocent woman to hide his crime and to be rid of the one person who might expose him. He could not yet prove Craik the diamond thief with a paper, but he had proof enough of Craik's blackened character and his motive and his lies to break the frame utterly, to clear Clements, and to turn the whole force of the inquiry, with a magistrate behind it, upon the true culprit. And he had, in his cold, sure mind, no doubt at all that once the hunt was turned upon Craik and his affairs, the rest would follow. The hidden diamonds and the embezzled fortune and the whole long fraud, and hang the man. The Baron Winterset looked at the papers spread on the table, the proof that cleared her, and the proof that damned her enemy, and then he looked at Clements's white blazing face, and for the first time in all their acquaintance something like a grim smile touched his hard mouth. He had his weapon now, he had it whole, and he had only to choose the time and the manner to strike, so that it should do the most complete and the most public and the most final work, and clear the wronged woman and unmask the thief before the very household that had condemned her. And he chose with a cold sense of justice that was almost poetry, to make the exposure absolute and the vindication certain and public and past all undoing. He would call the household together, and he would bring the law, in the person of the county magistrate, to be present, and there, before them all, before his mother and his servants in the assembled house that had branded her a thief, he would produce the proof of Julian Crake's old guilt, and lay bare his motive and his lies, and turn the whole matter inside out, and clear Clemence Aldis's name in the sight of all who had blackened it, and set the law upon the true thief at the very moment of his fancied safety. It was a stern plan, and a just one, and it asked of Clemence a little more patience, a little more of the hard waiting she had borne so long, but she had courage, and she trusted the grave man who had become, though neither of them yet spoke of it, so much more to her than her defender, and she held her nerve, and waited for the hour. The day came, a hard bright autumn day, with the light lying clear and pitiless over the great grey house and the brown moor beyond, and the Baron Winterset had made his quiet preparations, and brought his people together in the great cold hall, and had the county magistrate present, a solid, upright, sensible gentleman named Sir Cuthbert Vane, whom the Baron had privately begged to attend on a grave matter touching the honour of the house and the doing of justice, and who did not yet know the whole of what he had been brought to see. The old Baroness was there, still hard and angry and uncomprehending, resentful of her son's strange proceedings and impatient to have the thief punished and the thing done. The household was there, the servants ranged and murmuring, all agog at this strange summons and this grave presence of the law. And Julian Crake was there, smooth and grave and outwardly composed, but with a cold sick fear gnawing beneath his calm, for he could not tell what this meant, and every instinct of the hunted rogue in him was screaming that something had gone terribly wrong. And Clemence Aldis was there, pale and still, brought in by the Baron's order, standing quietly apart, her father's little worn portrait, for the first time in her life, worn openly at her throat over her plain gown. Outwardly a disgraced woman brought to hear her doom, inwardly a soul strung tight with hope and dread, waiting for the grave cold man to keep his word. And when they were assembled, and the murmuring had stilled, the Baron Winterset stood up before them all, in the cold bright hall, and spoke, in his level voice that carried to every corner of it. He said that he had brought them together, and had begged the presence of Sir Cuthbert Vane as a magistrate, because a grave wrong had been done in that house, and he meant to see it set right before them all. That the young gentlewoman lately accused among them of the theft of the diamonds had been, he was now assured past all doubt, falsely and wickedly accused, and that he would show them, then and there, by proof they could not gainsay, both that she was innocent, and by whose hand the true guilt lay. And there fell on that hall a silence like the silence after a thunderclap, and every face turned, and the old Baroness half rose in her chair with an angry cry, and Julian Crake, by the great hearth, went slowly grey, and gripped the back of a chair, and fought to keep his smooth face still. And the Baron, quite unmoved, turned to the magistrate, and to the company, and told them all. He told it plainly, and coldly, and completely, and he had the proofs in his hand. He told them first how he had doubted, from the first, the two-pat evidence and the strange zeal of the accusation, how he had sought the accused woman out and heard her, and believed her, and how she had put into his hands the thread that led to the truth, her dead father's provision, lodged against just such a day in a sealed box with a London attorney. And then he produced the papers that Gideon Marsh had brought north, and he laid bare, before them all, the whole hidden history, how the late Mr. Bartram Aldis, an honest gentleman and a connoisseur of unimpeachable name, had years before detected a certain man in a gross fraud and forgery in the matter of a valuable miniature, and had secured the proofs of it, letters and a forged paper, in that man's own hand, and had kept them, and had lodged them at last, with his own careful memorandum of the whole in the London box, as a protection for his daughter against the very man, and that the man so proved a forger and a cheat, in his own hand, before them all was. And here the Baron turned his cold level eyes full upon the grey and shaking steward Mr. Julian Craik. And he held up the letters, and the forged attribution, and the dead man's memorandum, and put them into the hands of the astonished magistrate, and he bade the company mark what it meant. Here was the man who had first breathed suspicion against the companion, and dropped his poison in her mistress's ear for weeks before ever the theft was done. The man who had so gravely urged the search, and been so ready with his hints. The man who of all the household had the freest hand with the keys and the coming and going of the house, and the oversight of everything. And here was that same man proved, out of the grave by his own victim's father. A forger and a cheat of years standing, with the strongest reason under heaven to wish the daughter of the man who held his guilt destroyed and discredited and silenced forever. And the Baron asked them, coldly, which was now the likelier thief, the friendless honest gentlewoman against whom there was nothing but a jewel that any hand might have hidden in her room, or the proven forger and trusted steward who had the means, and the opportunity and the double motive, both to steal the diamonds he was so hard pressed for and to fasten the blame on the one person he most needed to destroy. And then, while they were still reeling from it, the Baron dealt the last stroke, the one that broke Julian Craik past all mending. He said that, doubting the steward's honesty and more than this, he had that very morning, quietly and with the magistrate's authority, caused Mr. Craik's own rooms and his private strongbox on the estate to be secured and searched, and that there had been found. And he had it brought in then, and set upon the table before them all, the rest of the winter-set diamonds, the necklace and the bracelets and the second eardrop, hidden among the steward's private things, where he had kept them against the day he could turn them safely into money. The very treasure he had stolen, and for whose theft he had meant an innocent woman to be ruined, and perhaps to hang. And there they lay, blazing on the dark table in the cold bright light, the proof of everything, the diamonds in the thief's own keeping, and a great gasp, and then a great murmur went round the hall, and every eye turned, cold now and terrible, upon Julian Craik. And the smooth plausible man, exposed in his own hand as a forger and caught with the stolen diamonds in his own strongbox, his masterpiece shattered and his whole long fraud tumbling down about him and the gallows itself opening before him, lost, for the only time in his hard smooth life, his cold command of himself. He blustered and denied. And then, seeing the diamonds on the table and the letters in the magistrate's hand and the cold contempt and horror on every face turning now against him, he broke and cried out and would have fled, but the Baron's men were at the doors, and Sir Cuthbert Vane, grave and terrible now in his office, laid the law's hand upon him, and Julian Craik, the trusted steward, the smooth thief, the forger who had reached to ruin an innocent woman to save his own neck, was taken, then and there a detected felon, to answer for the whole of it before the law. And it all came out, in the days that followed, the long embezzlement and the stolen diamonds and the wicked frame. The whole cold history of his frauds unraveled at last. And Julian Craik was carried away to his trial and his ruin. Undone utterly, ruined by the one thing his cold reckoning had never thought to steal. And Clemence Aldous stood in the cold bright hall, in her plain gown, with her father's little portrait at her throat, cleared before them all, cleared in the sight of the very household that had branded her a thief, her innocence proved, her good name restored, the true villain unmasked and taken, and the whole cruel frame that had been built around her broken to pieces before the eyes of all who had believed it. The old Baroness, her hard, proud face working with shame and shock, sat stricken and silenced, forced to see how nearly she had helped to destroy an innocent creature and how she had been played all along by the smooth rogue she had trusted, and one by one the household, that had been so cold and so sure, looked now upon the wronged companion with ashamed and wondering respect, and some of them with tears, and Clemence, who had borne so much with so still a courage, felt the long dreadful strain break in her at last, and stood trembling, hardly able to believe that it was over, that she was cleared, that the nightmare was ended, and she lifted her eyes across all that murmuring hall to the one face she sought, the grave cold face of the man who had believed her when all the world condemned her, and had set his whole strength between her and her ruin, and she saw in his hard eyes, meeting hers, a look that no one else there could read, and that told her, without a word, everything. She did not fall into the Baron's arms, and he did not ask her to, and that is the last and best thing to know of them, for it is the whole meaning of her story. She was cleared now, and free, and her good name her own again, but she was still a poor gentlewoman with her way to make, and he was still the proud master of the house where she had been so wronged, and he was too honorable, and too proud, and too careful of her, to press his suit in the hour of her rescue, when she was too newly cleared and too beholden to say him a fair no. He did a thing then, instead, that showed the whole stern quality of him and won her more surely than any wooing could have done. He saw to her vindication being made complete and public, so that her good name should stand clear not only in that house but in the county and the world. He pressed upon her, gravely, such amends as he could make for the wrong done her under his roof, and would have settled on her, in reparation, a sum that would have kept her in modest independence all her days, and he offered, with a grave delicacy, to help her to a new and better situation, or to whatever future she might choose, entirely as she wished and owing him nothing. And then, having done all this, he did the hardest and the finest thing of all. He set her free. He told her, quietly, that she was cleared, and independent, and her own woman, free to go where she would and make what life she chose, with no claim upon her from him or any other, that he asked, and would take, nothing for what he had done, and that if she should ever, of her own free choice, wish to see him again, on whatever footing she herself named, she had only to send him word, and he would come, but that until she sent it, she should hear nothing from him that could weigh, by so much as a feather, upon a freedom he had helped her win. And then he saw her, with grave care, safely and honorably away from the grey house that had used her so ill, to a decent lodging in the town and the ordering of her own restored life, and he left her free. And she took her freedom, and she used it and she found it good. She was no longer the friendless creature who had come to the great grey house in the spring. She came out of that dreadful autumn cleared and vindicated and, by the Baron's amends, modestly provided, a gentlewoman with her good name shining the brighter for the trial it had passed through, and her own life in her own hands at last. She settled quietly, in the cathedral town she had loved in her girlhood, among a few old friends of her father's who welcomed the honest connoisseur's daughter with a warm respect. She took up again the reading and the drawing and the quiet study that had been her father's gift to her, and she drew, for the first time since his death, a free and easy breath in a world that had so nearly closed on her forever. And she thought, in that free quiet time, long and honestly, about the grave cold man who had believed her when no one else would, and had broken her ruin and asked nothing and set her free, and she found, thinking of him with her whole clear mind and her whole freed heart, that she loved him, not out of gratitude, though she was deeply grateful, and not out of need, for she needed no one now, but freely, and wholly, and of her own certain choosing, for the stern honesty and the lonely strength, and the hidden gentle heart of him, and for the way he had, alone of all the world, seen her true and believed her, and loved her enough to set her free. And when she was quite sure of it, quite sure that it was her own free heart and not the shadow of her rescue that spoke, she sent him word. It was a short letter, and a grave one, and it said only that she would be glad to see him again, on the footing of two free and equal friends, whenever he should care to come. And the Baron Winterset, who had waited in a hard patience she never fully knew, came, and this time there was no frame, and no fear, and no false accusation, and no dependence. There were only two proud, lonely, honest souls who had each found, late and unlooked for, the one other creature in the world they could wholly trust and wholly love. meeting now freely and as equals on the far side of the storm. He came through that winter and the spring that followed, often, and they walked, and talked out of the whole of their two deep minds and two starved strong hearts, and the love between them, that had been forged in trouble and left to grow in freedom, deepened and steadied into a quiet certain thing that needed no declaring and yet was declared, at last, quite simply. One soft evening in the early spring when he told her, gravely, that he had loved her since the day he saw her stand alone and wronged before them all and not break, and had held his peace until she should be free enough to hear it as a free woman, and asked her, not as a rescuer to a rescued but as an equal to an equal, whether she would have him. And Clemence Aldous, who was mistress now of her own restored life and her own good name and needed nothing any man could give her, said yes, freely and gladly, and of her own full choosing, because she loved him, and for no other reason under heaven, and gave herself, not as a wronged creature rescued nor a poor dependent raised, but as a free woman choosing, the one gift that is worth nothing unless it is given free. They were married in the summer, quietly, and she went to the great grey house on the moor not as the friendless companion who had been branded a thief in its cold hall, but as its mistress and its baroness, come freely and honored and beloved to the very place of her worst wrong. And the hall that had rung with her false accusation saw her come into it now, on the arm of the man she had freely chosen, as its lady. And the old baroness, humbled and softened by all that had passed and by the plain proof of how she had wronged the young woman, received her new daughter-in-law with a stiff broken kindness that was, for that hard old woman, a kind of atonement. And the household that had once closed against the thief opened now, glad and ashamed and loyal, to the wronged lady come to her own. And the great grey house, that had been so cold, grew warm, for the baron's long lonely struggle was eased at last, not by any fortune, but by the coming into it of a heart that understood his own, and the two of them, each so long alone, made of that grim old place, and of the ordering of the estate and the mending of the wrong that Craik had done it, a shared and a happy work, and were in the deep quiet way of two reserved souls who have found their one true mate, as happy as ever two people were. She lived long and honored and beloved, the once branded companion of the great grey house, mistress of it now and of a great heart, cleared and free and loved, and she kept to the end of her long life two faithful customs that those who loved her understood and strangers did not. She wore always, and would to her death, her father's small worn portrait of her mother, its hidden slip long since taken out and kept apart and its secret long since spent, but the little likeness itself dearer to her than any jewel she owned, dearer even than the great winter-set diamonds that were hers now to wear. For the mother's face it held, and the father's love it had carried, and the vindication it had, all unregarded, unlocked. And she would take it sometimes in her hand, in quiet moments, and be still, remembering the gentle foreseeing man who had armed his motherless girl against a danger he could only guess at, and had hidden her rescue in the one thing a thief would never think to steal. And she taught her own household, and set it down for those who should come after her, the whole plain truth of her story, that none who bore her name should ever forget it, how the friendless and the poor may be made to bear the crimes of the plausible and the powerful, how a proud hard man's plain love of justice had refused to let a wrong stand when all the world was content that it should, and how a woman with a clear mind and a steady courage and a father's care behind her had borne a false brand without breaking, and waited, and held her nerve and been cleared at last, and how there are things a thief will never think to steal because he cannot see their worth, and the small worn token a hard man passes over as mere sentiment may be the one key that unlocks the strong box where his whole cold design lies waiting to be undone. And on the one day in all the year that was the anniversary of that cold bright morning in the great grey hall, when the truth was read out and her name given back to her before all the world, the Baroness Winterset would go alone, in the evening, to the quiet of her own room, and take out the little worn portrait, and hold it by candlelight and be still a while with the memory of her gentle father and the wonder of her own hard-won deliverance, and the deep sure love of the grave clear-eyed man who had believed her when all the world would have condemned her. and had loved her enough to set her free before he ever asked her to be his. That was the whole of Clemence's story. The stolen diamonds and the false accusation and the smooth thief who reached to ruin her, and the father's foresight and the cold master's justice that broke the frame, and the small worn likeness that held the key when all the visible world was against her. And if you have stayed by her side to the end of it, as I asked you at the first to do, then you have seen the thing I have been waiting all this while to tell you, which is that the truth of an honest soul is worth more than all the evidence a liar can plant against it, and will out at the last if there is but one just man to seek it, and that a good man's foresight can reach out of the grave to arm the child he loves, and that there are things worth more than a thief can see, hidden in what he passes over, waiting only for the day of need. And so the candle burns low on another tale. Stay a while in the quiet, and tell me in the comments whether she chose rightly.